So let me just start sharing. Oh, okay, it's recording already. Okay, fine. Where is it? Keep getting this bug or something where the stuff, well, the thing I want to share is gone here from the stuff from the option. So let me open it again. No. Ok, it's here. Fechar todas as guias. Okay. Where is it? Okay, and downloads. Is it? Is that it? No. Okay, it's the other one. Sorry, guys. Mix up between different files here. Okay. Now I've opened it. Try to share it again. No, it's here. I'll share sound too in case I play something. Okay. So we're back at here. Last time we discussed a little bit of Reza's work. Let me remember. There was this basic framework that I'm building upon that has to do with our last discussion about the relationship between capital and the space of reasons, right? So this, in a sense, justifies talking about Reza's framework here as well. So yeah, we covered this last time. So then we get to this basic motto for the two meetings that has to do with the equality of all minds and the different senses that something like this can obtain. And I'm using here Reza's framework and our friend Gabriel's framework in his text, Freeing Thought from Thinkers, as different kinds of engagements with this idea. The expression on the equality of all minds is from Reza's, right? From the last chapter of Intelligence and Spirit, wherein he defines philosophy much in the same vein as he defines, sorry, what's going on? Okay. Much in the same vein as he defines the inhuman, in the labor of the inhuman, right? As some kind of commitment to a certain kind of elaboration. And this has to do with the thing that we were discussing in the last session and in the other session, the session about capital and space of reasons, this specific understanding of concepts as being, in a sense, a function of their own elaborations, a product of their posterior elaborations, right? This comes from the Wilfrid Sellers. We talked a little bit about it. In a sense, in Sellers, it accounts for concept change in scientific theorizing. Sellers is basically mainly a philosopher of science. And then with Brandon, this gets generalized for, language use in general. And Reza actually restricts, in a sense, at the same time restricts and expands upon this idea of a concept as a product of its own elaboration. You have an initial, it's almost like a concept has a certain trajectory, a historical trajectory of elaboration, right? You have an initial condition, an initial stage, and upon this game of giving and asking for reasons, it gets modified according to certain context-dependent events or happenings or theoretical changes, right? And then you can almost trace the trajectory of the concept through the several different historical stages where he undergoes, right? At the same time, not just the historical stages, but also it is a potentially a scale sensitive also concept of concept. Like somebody like Mark Wilson will use this kind of, not only this kind of framework, but a framework that is akin to this one. There's a lot of things in common in order to understand the declination, the different declinations that a concept have within different scales of analysis. For instance, in the physics of materials, for instance, it's talking a lot about metal beams and things like that. And yeah, so Reza, in a sense, is trying to propose that you know, a commitment to humanity on the one side, in the labor of the inhuman, as we discussed, entails a certain kind of elaboration of the concept of humanity that entails on its own side a certain practical set of endeavors that would realize these commitments. Of course, my own critique to this is that it is too theoretically sided, in a sense. So this is why I'm bringing also Gabriel's framework, because it's almost the opposite side of it. Like it does not start from a theoretical commitment to a set of concepts or anything like that, or from a theoretical desideratum of a certain elaboration of intelligence as such that is supposed to coincide with the concept of philosophy considered in its history as a whole, as Reza proposes, right? So we kind of fleshed out a little bit with this business of truth candidates in order to understand what is this concept of intelligence that gets unfolded by philosophy primarily. You can make the case that it is also unfolded by other disciplines, but Reza is basically trying to flesh out a certain concept of philosophy here, and yeah, and which ultimately would demand the artificialization of intelligence itself, right? And then this, in a sense, weaves together like all the book. This is the final chapter of Intelligence and Spirit, and as many of you know, it is a book that actually comes out of a certain Hegelian thesis concerning sapience and concerning language use, and comes up with a toy model of what is necessary for an agent to have in order to count as an intelligent agent. So there are several chapters that are trying to flesh out some aspects of this. Like the first is basically a philosophical chapter, basically that puts forward a mainly Pittsburghian interpretation of Hegel. Then the second chapter introduces the toy model. The third is about forms of sensibility in the Kantian sense, like what perception of space and time and sensible contents in general. And then you get different degrees of complexity than when he's actually developing language in this agent. Like the fourth chapter is kind of excursus about time, and then the fifth, sixth, and seventh develops this concept of language. That gets its you know, its culminating point in the seventh one, wherein he discusses the Girardian framework that we mentioned also last time. And the eighth one is like this ultimate thing that is justifying philosophy as this endeavor that actually demands the artificialization of intelligence in a deontic sense. So, I think somebody said something at the Chat? No? Just let me check.
No.
Oh, okay. So practical consequences, we're talking about the practical consequences, labor of the inhuman. Okay. Then I fleshed a little bit out about these practical consequences in terms of the pragmatics of language use and and of thinking of different kinds of different sets of abilities. That is something that influences Brez a lot, I know, and influences me a lot. That comes from this book by Brandon that's called Between Saying and Doing. This is just a very coarse-grained depiction of what's going in the book, but it's basic to give an intuitive view of what we are meaning. What does it mean to say, to elaborate a set of abilities and this kind of thing. So then I'm shifting the point of view here with this Marx quote that from the economic philosophical manuscripts that Gabriel is focusing upon in this paper. So I'll just read it. In order to supersede the idea of private property, the idea of communism is enough. In order to supersede private property as it actually exists, real communist activity is necessary. History will give rise to such activity, and the movement, which we already know in thought to be a self-superseding movement, will in reality undergo a very difficult and protracted process. But we must look upon it as a real advance that we have gained at the outset, an awareness of the limits as well as the goal of the historical movement, and are in a position to see beyond it. So this is the first part. So this is kind of relevant to have to divide in two parts. This extract. When communist workmen gather together, their immediate aim is instruction, propaganda, etc. But at the same time, they acquire a new need, the need for society, and what appears as a means had become an end. This practical development can be most strikingly observed in the gatherings of French socialist workers. Smoking, eating, and drinking, etc., are no longer means of creating links between people. Company, association, conversation, which in turn has society as its goal, is enough for them. The brotherhood of man is not a hollow phrase, it is a reality, and the nobility of man shines forth upon us from their work-worn figures. Quite beautiful.
Marx is so, yeah, man. When he's not dissing at other people, he writes really well.
Yeah. When he's not a jerk, a complete jerk.
Yeah. When he's not the worst troll ever, he's like
a complete alcoholic jerk, right?
Yeah.
He's very beautiful, very beautiful. In fact, I love this paragraph. So Marx's quote presents a conundrum. The first paragraph differentiates between the abstract idea of communism and the concrete work of bringing it about. But the second paragraph offers a strange twist that Tupinambá reads a reversal between. Actually, it's not you that's reading; it's there. So okay, I withdraw this. But that puts forward a reversal between means and ends. If in the first paragraph practice is lauded instead of theory because of its goal-orientedness towards the achievement of emancipation, the very act of organizing in second paragraph becomes the end in itself once workers have become conscious of a need that is in a sense provided for by the very sociality involved in organizing. So I quote Gabriel here, this active movement, a painfully difficult process of liberation, which is 100 times more important than the work of philosophers sitting home aloof, thinking of the idea of freedom, is nonetheless suddenly interrupted or distorted by the appearance of a new need. This new need has a very peculiar structure because, unlike the real estrangement of human life, which can only be superseded by the actual overcoming of private property, it can find satisfaction in the present, in the very process of socialization of workers. This new need, which is produced by the very formal dimension of the organization, the forming of workers, inverts the relation between means and ends. Rather than organize in order to accomplish certain tasks of interest for the movement, the communist workmen take part in the harsh struggle for actual communism so that they can engage in smoking, eating, and drinking. In a sense, they become in their pleasure in company, association, conversation, like the lazy philosophers Marx had just criticized, who think of communism for the pleasure of thinking. So Tupinambá's text is in many respects a meditation upon such reversal. Okay. So, free thought from thinkers. The basic idea or a wager can be formulated as follows. There are ideas which can only be consistently thought of within certain forms of collective organization. That is, there are ideas which can only be properly developed if their conceptual construction is tied together with the practical construction of a given institutional space. I quite like this formulation. It's kind of tricky because, in a sense, the formulation itself lends itself to an understanding that is much closer to what Reza is doing. But in fact, the development of this idea in Gabriel's text is very different from Reza's way of understanding this. But nevertheless, you have also the conceptual element, the conceptual construction of an idea that goes with a practical construction of a space that is not any kind of space, but it is an institutional space. So it's almost like all the elements of pragmatic linguistic framework are there, but they will get shifted by the development of the paper itself. But Binabad derives the concept of such a conceptual construction tied with the practical construction of an institutional space, not from the practical deontic determination of theoretical language use, such as in the Brandomian account that Reza largely accepts and develops, but from a de facto emergence of abstraction out of social practice that can be located in Marx's account of commodity form. So you get also a quote by Marx here: a sugar loaf being a body is heavy and therefore has weight, but you can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight. Here you get this kind of Hegelian, like in the chapter on measure, right? That you get a certain criterion took from the relationship between certain stuff out there, right? So the value of commodities, on the other hand, is inherently social. That is, it's itself relational. Commodities, when removed from the field of exchange relations, maintain only their natural and heterogeneous determinations. That is, the sugar loaf, and, the different bundle of properties that make up a sugar loaf. Those maintain their natural heterogeneous determinations, those responsible for each of their use values. But we find there nothing to be expressed regarding value as such. This leads us to add a third remark to the previous ones, namely the fact that the homogeneity between the bodies in a given relation must be extended to the scale. So one determination was the fact that you must compare different things in order to extract a certain concept, a certain criterion that will be further used in comparisons, right? And a second determination was a kind of homogeneity between, I don't know, kinds of things that, things that can be, receive a measure of weight, for instance. So certain homogeneity between the bodies that are being used in order to construct the measure. And the third one will be this about the scale. The measurement itself, physical forms are made legible by physical scales, while social forms are made legible by social scales. This thesis, which vacillates between the self-evident and the obscure, allows us to determine a fundamental distinction between the natural and the social relations. For in the latter case, the being that is comparatively measured and the comparison itself are not only of the same consistency, a good word, I mean, we're talking about homogeneity, right? But a certain same consistency, but are rather indiscernible. Nothing distinguishes what it means to express the value of a commodity and what it means for commodities to constitute their value to begin with. Yeah, so you have a different kind of form at place here, like physical form, like you can take out the weight of a certain set of objects by comparing them, and then you have social form, which is the medium that determines value as such. So social forms, such as a value form, become rational, that is, enter into relations of proportion, which make certain of its properties legible through the very same process that renders them actual. The very being of a social relation under investigation is homogeneous and indistinguishable from the process through which its properties become legible for us. So here we get, I think, we start to get the basic difference. Like, as I said before, the concept of, you know, an institutional space that is able to engage in the practical construction of a certain idea, it does not derive from here in Gabriel's framework, from the cognitive architecture of the agents that are part of the institutional space. Whereas I would argue that yes, you would have to have that, but I don't think Gabriel is denying that. He's just suggesting that there is a certain social dynamics that goes on in a different scale of description that engenders different kinds of criteria, right? That are not directly the result of any engagement from the agents themselves. Like you don't get value from one person acting, right? So you need to have a complete social formation in order to have a certain social practice that makes value a thing. So, and which in turn organize the social practice itself. So, yeah, let me see. I don't need to read all of it, I think. Yeah, I think this is the kind of contention here. We have just examined the meta-economical hypothesis that a subject of science in political economy is not the actor of exchange. I just said that, but something that is implicated and determined by the commodity form itself. Reducibly, social forms are in fact constituted by the indistinguishable point where their being and their thought mutually support each other, but such a point paradoxically does not coincide with ourselves as thinking beings. The starting point of capital is rather that there is such a thing as a social form which thinks, a form of thought that is distinct from thought. Yeah, I understand. Personally, I understand what this means. There is a certain kind of unfolding that goes on at a different kind of scale that it can get conceptualized in a certain way, and which has causal efficacy.
This is the same move that Gabriel and Dennis do when they consider how commodities appear to one another. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there is it's very similar.
It seems like the same.
Yeah, there is one difference between the two, I think, which is the place where this quote from Zizek comes from. This idea of a form of thought that is distinct from thought, and actually this whole discussion here, it's a text where he's developing this a thesis that that ignorance about certain social phenomena is not ignorance about an object of the social reality, but it's actually part of the object. Meaning that when it's his way to criticize, for example, people who say that to arrive at class consciousness, you need to be enlightened about social reality, because one of his claims is that, well, the fact that you ignore something is part of the dynamic of the social dynamic. If you come to know that what you ignored, you at the same time destruct the object you wanted to know about, because it was an active part of it, your ignorance. So he says, ideology is not ignorance, ideology is not false consciousness about reality, is the reality that is sustained by false consciousness. So if you were to remove the ignorance to finally look upon the reality, you would lose the reality you wanted to look upon, right? It's a way of criticizing the sort of strategies to overcome ideological positions through knowing better, and the sort of cynicism with regards to identifications and so on. His point is that there is something about social reality that it's not simply benefiting from ignorance because you are more easily manipulated. No, the strategies through which you are allowed to ignore certain things, they organize the consistency of the social space. So there is a small difference between that idea, which is very similar to the idea of the unconscious, right? It's very psychoanalytic, which is saying like there is something that thinks despite you rather than with you, right? You think you're doing something, but because of what you're allowed to ignore while doing that, the effects will be different than you imagine, right? But doesn't have an unconscious theory. He has a theory that is indifferent to consciousness. And I think that this is
that's very deep. Yeah, I see what you mean.
That's a very small difference. I think that is a shift between what is written in this text and what we're working on right now. Like, if you see, like, this text doesn't really work with these ideas on shifting levels of analysis and things like this, because it's the things that you're not capable of seeing directly, they are kind of already in this black box of unconscious stuff in a certain way. Whereas with Badiou, you don't even have like the drama of not knowing. That's not really a relevant category because it's not really about that, right? So it's interesting because I think that you have a kind of a triad, in fact. You have a theory of concept with Reza. You have a theory of cognition with Reza. It's concept and cognition. It's consciousness and thinking in Zizek, because thinking kind of plays against consciousness, right? And you have thinking and concept in Badiou. You don't have really, consciousness is not relevant, cognition is not, it's like as relevant as every other determination. Like,
but you mean thinking and concept in Badiou? What do you mean?
I mean, like the idea of reason or something like this. I think in the tree is played against different things, like reason and cognition, reason and consciousness, and reason and thinking, which for Badiou means something slightly different. So
reason, but not concept, right?
No, concept. I think it's yeah. I'm just trying to see like what would be the one term we could pit the others against.
I understand reason like the function of intelligibility of something. Like if you understand reason as like that which is capable of extracting intelligibility, be it through language, right, being through consciousness, maybe Zizek with the caveat that there is something that is a blind spot within it, which comes from psychoanalysis. And the blind spot is also, it's kind of a resistant point that is an information as well, right? Because
that's the whole point.
You cannot symbolize directly, but the fact that you are not symbolized directly and the way it is resistant to symbolization is positive information about the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So and then reason for what was the third one? Thinking in the Badiou sense, like with kind of this that I'm always having a problem understanding this, because for me it's like a kind of also a bundle of different things that gets caught up in what Badiou is calling thinking. If you don't want to be a Platonist, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint what is thinking for Badiou, which is a kind of an interest of mine. Like to actually provide a kind of a reductive account of thinking in Badiou, because I don't want to uphold Platonism. But
yeah, but I mean, I don't know what you think he means by Platonism, because I think he gives a couple of definitions which I find very convincing, which is he takes a relation that we usually consider to be vertical between things and a way to abstract, for example, properties, classes of things, and so on. And he talks about the horizontal relation between those things. So, for example, you can have the arrangement of furniture in a room, and then you have a different arrangement where all the chairs were pulled to a corner.
I mean, but does this count as thinking? Like
just a second. I'm taking small steps, right? So there is some process of separating things into classes that is happening, not really with regards to cognition or whatever, but regards to comparing two state of affairs, right? So it's the vector is between states of affairs, not states of affairs and some representation, right? You still have that question, but that's not where the question of thinking is taking place. Now, the thing that you expect from thinking in opposition to, let's say, classification, is that when you reorganize the material, something that wasn't there or something that wasn't given now is there. So there is not only a vector between states of affairs, but something in the second state of affairs has some added structure that you didn't have in the first, right? So he uses the generic to talk about states of affairs as situations, new states of affairs as generic supplements to situations, which bring about indiscernible subsets. And he shows, look, the relation that you call like a vertical one between situations and representations as the only way to justify the appearance, the emergence of something indeterminate in these classes or abstractions, you can actually account for it in a horizontal way. So it's Platonistic in the sense that you can use the Platonistic terms, but it has no two realms to talk about. So in my opinion, I mean, you still have all the questions of representation, conceptualization, all of those are still open. You can still...
Yeah, they're still open, but the fact is that this ditching representation, like he seemed to be part of the same, like, French philosophy movement of ditch representation.
There's no ditching. There's no ditching. It's just a question of, it's true that I can name the furniture. It's true. Is it important? It's very important. Is it sufficient condition to talk about thinking? No. If you don't move the furniture around, it's not enough. It's an active, practical theory of thinking rather than one where the ways you're representing it are gonna make the big difference. Like, it's still there.
There's a kind of like suspicion of representation, it seems like, in some of his, especially when you look at more like being an event time with the identification of states of presentation and like the state and those kind of weird shiftings that he does.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, that there is an animosity to two things, I think. One is like the philosophical animosity to French philosophers who thought that criticizing representation was enough. Like, Badiou is on the opposite side. If you take like his step, like in 1988, he was the guy criticizing Lyotard, Derrida, and these guys for thinking that being very subversive with their approach to language was anything relevant politically. Like, I don't think that he distrusted representation for that reason. And then on the other side, I think that he has this idea that there is a kind of possible confusion between the infinite ways in which you can separate parts of a world, which are in a certain sense already given. Like, true, you can do that, but okay, that's kind of there already. And the difference from that, which is to actually construct piece by piece a part that has no name in that situation, right? And he even defines doing that as enriching a language. It's not against language, against representation. On the contrary, if you are able to name that part that had no name in the base model there, you have a richer language. So that's how he calls it, like subject language. The whole theory of the generic, half of it is all about the naming and the ranks of how to name the parts and the conditions for the construction of this. Like, it's very intricately representational as well. I just think that it's not about representation. Like, representation is a big part of it. Naming language is a big part of it. I mean, it's mathematical logic, for Christ's sakes. I mean, it's language everywhere.
I always read that the Platonism as something about like accepting like mathematical structure everywhere, and that is like a first term.
Yeah, this is also a point that I contention about.
Yeah.
This.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is we can get to the fine grain of the reading. He has his justifications. I mean, he never claims that being is made of mathematics, or that there is another world of mathematical ideas. His first
So
work.
it's not that the kind of Platonism that there is this world of mathematical objects or anything like that, but things that everything is prima facie mathematically structured, and it becomes kind of structured in a certain way. Like, if he's able to say a priori what is the space of possible answers to a question within a world, it seems that you have a certain mathematical structure that captures all the possible answers.
No, it captures the structure that unknowable possible answers, like a particular information about it. It doesn't capture everything,
But
doesn't capture that much.
You capture the possible slots that can, receive a value is already to capture the basic structure of the world, right?
I think it's more that any structure that can take shape will have kind of like at its core like a mathematical root, which is just like the relation between its objects and like what we can say. I mean, ultimately you may not know it, but it's just anything that is like has between networks of relations. And I think the whole thing with like the infinite stuff is that like, even if we don't know the internal structure of everything, like with language, for example, it has to do with like how like millions of people use these words in different ways. And somehow we all sort of agree, but there is this like objective structure of how this person uses this word, this person uses this word, this person uses this word. Doesn't mean that that like is a representation of like what that means physically in a way, but like, it's almost like the data from which we could choose something, which is like rational. I don't know.
I also think a lot of this hinges on Badiou's attempt to kind of reread mathematics, because I've been reading parts of Number and Numbers recently, and his attempt to kind of use ordinals and well, a bit like surreals in that case, but like, Dedekind cuts and ordinals to rethink an idea of number that doesn't fall under the count, but still gives us a real sense of structure. And I think a large part of the Platonism is that mathematics enables us to get a concept of the idea, which is neither reducible to the human, but also doesn't fall into a transcendence beyond, right? Like that for Plato, like as opposed to most of the philosophy that Badiou is responding to, ideas are not part of representation, right? They're not part of that order, which is key for what he's differentiating against most of philosophy with his Platonism. And that in order to kind of like establish the connection between that order of knowledge and being human, mathematics is the kind of framework we can do that. But I don't think that necessarily then says that we can then represent, especially in like a predictable way, all of reality or anything.
Actually, I think that Numbers is a really good example, because it's Badiou's only book on philosophy of mathematics in a way, right? And what do you get in that book? You get him addressing the classic question of philosophy of mathematics: what is number? But rather than giving you a philosophical answer, he tells you a story that lasts for 150 years, that goes from, I mean, much more than that, because he begins with the Greeks, but then it goes Frege, Cantor, and all those guys, Dedekind, so on, up to John Conway. And the problem is that when you have integers, irrational numbers, complex numbers, real numbers, imaginary numbers, transcendental numbers, like the question, what is it that they have in common? A philosopher could answer it straight up, try to come up with some theory of what they have in common. What Badiou tries to do with that book is show you a different state of affairs inside of mathematics, which is the invention of surreal numbers, which mathematically gives you the concept that unifies them, rather than philosophically gives you the concept, right? Surreal numbers are interesting because they allow us to actually write down in one homogeneous way an infinite class of different types of numbers. Pretty much includes all the types of numbers we know today and a bunch more that we haven't discovered yet. So it's the whole exercise of the book is a proof of what he calls a Platonist position, which is not to ask philosophically the question, what is X, and abstract from mathematics to philosophy, but to formulate the problem. Look, Dedekind cuts with the reals, infinite, transfinite numbers, complex numbers. What the fuck does all of this have in common? Like, what are the properties that all these things have in common? It's not that easy to find. And then say, well, this is an open problem for mathematics. Let's follow how mathematics dealt with that problem. And then he goes through all these guys trying to deal with this issue. And then he presents another mathematician providing an immanently mathematical answer to that question, which, when it's presented mathematically, actually has downsides. It's not really the exact answer. It's not meant to be an answer in some sense. It's an invention in itself. But your philosophy helped to render something intelligible about a problem, helped you to stay in contact, in intimate contact with the development of something that could only appear as mathematics itself, which is a bunch of mathematical steps, forward, backwards, decisions, and so on, to the point of the innovation with the surreal numbers, which is a really amazing thing, right? So it's not about formulating it and then moving vertically to what is the concept that captures generally what all numbers have in common. It is a way of positioning yourself in such a way that you commit yourself to the possibility that the same field that produces the problem might at some point produce at least the hint of the solution. And of course, there is a philosophical surplus to this. So let's say dramatize it in this way, or to choose some things over another in this selection, in this discussion. But that's why the structure for Badiou is always that philosophy is not thinking so much as thinking the thought of mathematics, right? There is a commitment beforehand that mathematics thinks, and then you can ask the question, what is it thinking? Rather than to position yourself in the position to be the thought of mathematics, right? Mathematicians are doing, we're going to explicitate what they don't know that they're doing. That's not really where he's going, right?
But at the same time, like, I would push back at the precise place where because he gives so much importance to the names that mathematicians give things throughout his theory. And yet that's precisely where he's critical of Conway, right? Like, he says the surreal numbers is a kind of reformist name because he actually says capital N numbers.
Yeah, there's a couple times when it's a little suspicious. It's mostly fine though.
Yeah, but it's like,
my point is, like, it's just indicative of a general question I have around the role of critique, because he says these things like philosophy doesn't really engage with the thinking of mathematics as mathematics, but then he has these like moments where he actually does seem to say,
yeah, but honestly, I find that like a very honestly, I don't think it's a very generous reading. Like, the guy spends 300 pages following in a didactic and closed way bunch of developments in mathematics, and all the arrogant philosophical manipulation he adds to it is like, I wish the name was different. Like, come on, that's very little critical. That's still a lot of, leeway to mathematics itself if all you're doing, like he does in Being an Event, talk about the fact that Cohen uses generic like Marx. Like he would never make the. I mean, if you take him as an honest person, you would assume he would never make the argument. It's true because it's the same word, or it's wrong because it's the wrong word. But it's,
well, no,
of
it's
course,
not about
there
whether or
is.
not it's the right word or the wrong word. It's more a question of like, I feel like he was making, I think, like an ungenerous reading of what Conway was doing at that point.
I mean, I think it's a good example of like he wants.
Like, I think there's an issue there. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I remember the point where you're talking about. He basically, to reconstruct it, after he presents Conway's construction, his kind of generalization of Dedekind cuts, and he says, you know, Cohen shouldn't have called this the surreal numbers. It's like joking kind of supplementation. He should have called them numbers with capital N, because this is the largest mathematical structure in number theory to account for different. You need to restrict the surreals to get different types of numbers. I agree. I find it in bad taste that he couldn't just add a remark in the form of, you know, what we're looking at when we're looking at surreal numbers for a Platonist would be like a materialist version of what we used to call number with capital N, something like this. Like, he's annoying with those things, but I find it very easy to put it in the annoying Badiou box rather than we just found a symptomatic point in the book. I find it a bit like, you know, it's a bit superficial with regards to the strategy of the whole book.
Going back a bit though, about kind of this like, I guess like suspicion about the, I guess like mathematical Platonism. Specifically, there's a tweet that this reminded me of. But like, I mean, even if you think about like, when you talk about like the Dedekind cut, I don't know if you're familiar with it, construction of the real numbers, that in itself is already like a really big thing that involves choosing big infinite sets. So like, I feel like often when you think about mathematics as only dealing with like the real numbers, which is what most people think, which is just one very small subsection. There's a whole bunch of other things that are completely unrelated and have completely different structure. I think that kind of like misses the point, because it's much bigger. One thing that like a lot of people give it credit. Like, I mean, category theory on its own, like encompasses so many like topics in other like random fields that like have to do with relations and everything. But anyways, the tweet that I got reminded of was, if you guys know about the Banach-Tarski paradox, about how you can take a sphere and twist it weird ways and then get 3 spheres, or basically cut it up, twist it. But the tweet was some people still talk about Banach-Tarski as if the controversial step is the axiom of choice and not the identification of R3 with physical space. I thought that was really good, because I think we often assume things like, oh, okay, this is physical space, therefore we look at things about physical space and we have these weird mathematical things that make no sense, that seem to not align with the world. But sometimes that might mean that like our choice of identification of mathematical structure itself was wrong in the first place. Like those signs of weird things. Like, of course, nothing that is the real numbers exists in the real world, at least not in the way that you can cut it up in this infinite, tiny slices. Like, I mean, with quantum mechanics, we have a limit on
this is
a length,
about this.
maybe.
Yeah, you have a pixel of reality.
Anyways, yeah. So I thought that was a good.
Yeah, I like that. I saw that tweet. I think it was. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I saw it.
I think, yeah, Daniel Litt reached.
Yeah, he's very good with his tweets.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite math Twitter guys.
My Twitter, the math Twitter sphere is very good.
Oh yeah.
But look, I think I would suggest, just to return to the text, which the operation that I really think is the most useful in this sense, because honestly, I mean, personally, I started studying with the Zizek approach, which is actually, I think, much closer to Rez and these things in many ways. there are things that are not philosophical and that I didn't find another way to talk about, if not having to sit through and read a very annoying set of books by this French guy. Like, if somebody can prove to me that I can think the same things with other means, I'd be happy to do it. The problem is not if it's nice, if it's cringe, if it is outdated, the actual philosophy. The problem is the thing that the philosophy helps to name. And that part of the process, which I think does require some generosity with the idea that doing politics has a specific experience, which is not immediately translatable into a general sense of experience that applies to any other thing, which I think is the same with other fields. Like, we are used to talking about the fact that it takes some trouble to, you know, talk about love and things like this. There is something singular about loving. It's not just anything. I think that that's something in that part of the strategy that is relevant to why Badiou becomes relevant to this discussion. In himself, taken as, like, say, the starting points to something, probably if I had an opportunity to do that when I was younger, and it didn't kind of catch on. Like, Dennis and I were studying Badiou and Zizek like 10 years ago, and we actually were more on the Zizek-Lacan side than Badiou. We were always annoying a friend of ours about this. Like, I remember it seeming too affirmative, it seeming too voluntaristic, it seeming like it didn't consider the unconscious, didn't consider language, didn't consider the back drive, it didn't consider, I mean, we had a very long list of reasons why Badiou was the naive philosopher, you know? So there is something that actually happened, and not in a philosophical sense, that made it happen, created a situation where this Platonist guy, who writes things in the weirdest, most obnoxious, arrogant ways, has something going for him that makes it easier to say some things than with other resources. I think that's the point, right? That's even the point of that quote by Marx. There is something naive, even like that naivety that Badiou has, that makes him say, like, Conway should write numbers with capital N. I mean, I know that naivety from practical political experience, like, because it takes the same absolutely ridiculous position to call yourself communist, like, for reals, like, to meet 3 people in a room and say this is a communist meeting. Like, what the fuck? Like, it's totally arrogant, it's totally absurd, it is absolutely obnoxious, you know. It sounds naive from the outside, but there is the idea that the word communist is naming a real referent, but that real referent only exists because of something you're doing at the same time that you're naming it, right? Which is exactly why he thinks capital number is the right name to refer to the set of things that are gathered together because of the strategy of surreal numbers and so on. Like, there is something about this that does touch on something interesting, and it does come with a lot of baggage that you need to kind of fine-tune your way through it and learn how to separate what's useful and what is not. But I think that in the case of this text, for example, the usefulness is more like in the inverse. I'm not trying to defend Badiou in the beginning and then get to politics, right? There is a thesis that has nothing to do with Badiou, and I think it can be
I don't think the value of this text hinges upon, you know, Badiou, thinking in the sense of Badiou or defending this.
Yeah.
I think you have a very instrumental kind of use here of Badiou.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and this is the point where it gets separated. Like, you are, yeah, this was really interesting that you're differentiating between this Zizekian way of understanding. The Badiou one, I was going to read just the Badiou part where this is really explicit here. Like, what this means is that in order to understand the new place of thinking in a circle, where a certain indifference to thought is promoted, we need a theory of ideas which would allow us to state that while the individual participants of a collective might be busy with their private concerns, the very institution they compose goes on thinking. There is perhaps no other philosopher today more equipped to supplement our Zizekian. Actually, it's our Zizekian theory first, right?
Yeah.
Of social forms, of collective forms in which there is thought outside of thinking subjects, than Alain Badiou and his theory of political ideas. For Badiou, thinking is not a particularly conscious or unconscious activity. So this is different from Zizek, right?
Yeah.
There, right? It's not a conscious or unconscious. Its principal property is to produce and maintain an immanent indifference to its given domain. And then I think that's I think what makes this explicit is the mathematical thing, right? The last one, like mathematical formalism is essentially a set of rules bound by indifference to consciousness. It can contradict our intuitions. That point I might have a quibble with, but we don't have to talk about this today here. To community, its deductive power does not respect particular customs, and even to the physical world, there are consistent formal systems with no natural models at all, like what Yasha was saying in a sense, right? This does not mean that Badiou considers all formalism to be mathematical, but rather that only a concept of formalism based on indifferentiation could also apply to mathematics. It is the most general concept of formalism. Like in a sense, yeah, the thing with the Platonism, the thing is, I was silent now for a couple of minutes because it's quite difficult now. This is not part of my presentation, right? Just because we launched upon discussing this, is that it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where I have a problem with this. I mean, if it's just the most general concept of formalism that is, condition of intelligibility of anything that has a certain unfolding or is a pattern governed activity or even a rule obeying activity, which is even more easier to think of as thinking, right? I don't have a problem with that. The problem is the point where this gets treated as a kind of given, as something that is, of course, within truth procedures, this is not so much the point, because truth procedures are always enmeshed in a kind of immanent unfolding that has to do with that tinkering of certain axioms, the testing dimension of it, which I can easily think of as a form of abductive realism. Like, instead of a realism in the sense of having a given structure of reality that is ready-made out there, you have this abductive form of realism where you take it as real if something is working as a truth candidate, as an axiom, and it's proving itself in a sense in practice. I don't have a problem with that. So I can go a long way then with Badiou, but there is some moment there, where I have a certain difficulty, and I'm having a really hard time trying to pinpoint exactly what is the exact problematic issue there for me.
Yeah, we know. I mean, my thesis, right? I have the impression that most people are bothered with Badiou not because of what he affirms to be the case, but by the things that he affirms not to be of the purview of us to affirm to be the case. So, for example, you started your sentence saying, I like the idea of working with assuming a very general idea of what a formalism means, broader than mathematics, which I think is Badiou's case. The book is called Being an Event, precisely because there is things that are not mathematical. It's not about turning everything into mathematics. But for those things which are not mathematical, we still want to have a way of talking about their forms, right? And about what of non-mathematical structures, still what we can say about these novel structures without over-determining them. So, for example, for Badiou to claim that novelty will work abductively is too much. I mean, it might be, in some sense, you might provisionally say that that's what we learned from the novelties of our days. That in the 20th century, a lot hinged on the poetic figure of the explorer, pioneer going towards the unknown, that a lot hinged on artistic experimentation, that also had a very strong foot on indetermination and kind of an openness to something that comes from the outside, that is not curated by the artist. That in politics, we try to open up the space for revolutions inside of revolutions that were not pre-programmed. But that's a historically determined thing. Badiou is a Marxist. You cannot say from philosophy how novelties would need to come about, right? Even he says, like, mathematics in the future will come up with much better things than generic subsets to explain new things that I don't know about. And philosophy needs to be open to exist in that future point. Remember that quote about the future metaphysics? Remember how the quote went that we read together for the Logics of Worlds class at UFRJ? Like when he's saying, yeah, like I'm preparing a sort, yeah, it's something like I'm preparing the ground for like a philosophy that can have conditions that's not my own, you know, something like this. I don't remember exactly how it goes, but I think that that's the sort of statement that he kind of forbids from his perspective, which I think is where a lot of philosophy, it's built its weapons. That's what we build our weapons to do, to say something about what's coming, how it's gonna come, what are the best tools. The idea that the coolest part of philosophy is kind of interdicted because we need to kind of look aside is kind of annoying. So I have the impression that the stuff that he actually says, it's quite contemporary to our current philosophical world. It's not using mathematics in a foundational sense. It uses much of the same mathematics that other philosophers are using. It has an interest in reason without being kind of, you know, authoritarian about it or whatever. It's pluralistic and so on, all of those things. But then when it comes to spilling out the beams of the step-by-step of something and talking about the structure to reach new concepts emerge, he purposefully doesn't want to have something to say about that. Like, he really wants this to first appear, and then we see what appeared. Like, I think that that's really fundamental. Like, the way he reads Marx has that tone to it. The critics he makes for Lacan have also that point, right? When he says that there is no, like, stop with this idea that the real of the subject is the source of all novelty, as if you already have everything you need to transform the world. Like, or the same with like the idea that the proletariat is a guaranteed sort of subject. It's always about saying, dude, these things emerge somewhere else. Fuck.
But just what I wanted to say is that this is the part that I get a bit like honestly, I mean, we discuss this a lot. We take it seriously in trying to reformulate what Badiou is doing and put it up to the standards of certain conditions. But there is a moment where, you know, the given and seeing the given in everything becomes kind of counterproductive, in my opinion, because the guy literally looked for a formalism that allows you not to take logic as a given, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what Heyting algebras are not a positive thing in the sense of worlds are like Heyting algebras. The statement he's looking for is, I cannot assume as a given what is the logic of a world. Now, how do you rationally say that? Well, Heyting algebras help you do that. I mean, it is, you can formulate it both ways. You can formulate it as this statement was given, but you can just as easily switch the foreground and the background and say, what would you do if you don't want to take logic as a given? Well, you have a hard time justifying what else can be said then. Well, here's a statement that will live up to the standard of not assuming that much about the world, and at the same time managing to say something that has consequence, which is usually the complicated thing, right? How do you keep yourself from supposing too much as a given, but at the same time don't need to go back to some empty statement that has no consequence? That's the hard trade-off, right? High-T algebras are a really good example of that. And I mean, nothing prevents anyone from finding a better way of not assuming something given about logic and saying something rational about it. That's fine. But I think that surpassing Badiou on that account might be more productive, right? In the sense of, no, I can say something more interesting or more useful about worlds without over-determining their logic. But saying that the world has High-T algebra for a structure is actually not saying that much. And I think that that's something that gets underemphasized in his whole ontology. It is all about underdetermination. It's like that's the paradox. How can you underdeterminate so much about the topic you're talking about and still take out some interesting consequence? That's the weird kind of trick that the guy keeps. Like, dudes, I'm not going to say anything about the world. I will not take as a given, not even what is the operator that unifies things. I don't know what counts things as one. I don't want to know. I cannot take it as a given. So I'm going to try to make the broadest, most underdetermined statement about that. And lo and behold, I can still say interesting things about novelty, representation, even though I underdetermine. So I find that to be a more generous version of it, rather than saying Badiou is claiming that everything is made of sets, which I don't think is really the case. Like,
yeah,
I mean, the only reason to underdetermine so much the ontological, phenomenological point is so that other things can determine. Right. So, but if there's no other, if we don't want other things to determine, then we will feel like that underdetermination is like a problem, I think. So, I mean, I think that's also something
I think the basic tension there is between, Badiou and the transcendental approach, really. I mean, because the transcendental approach will have to explain how mathematics gets descriptive purchase upon reality. And this is not to say that it's language that does it, it is consciousness, but it is, you have to provide like a genetic account of how, from the standpoint of, cognition, mathematics is able to capture structures that we can cognize, even structures that are initially beyond our own scale, which is, which is usually my course of action philosophically. I'm usually more convinced by the transcendental approach than taking math as I don't know, the axiomatic one, perhaps I can call it something like that. So I think this is the basic tension, because if you do not justify how your symbolic resources get purchased upon reality, and that means language, that means math, and of course there is something to be said between about the relationship between math and language and all of that. If math, for instance, from the Brandomian kind of framework, if math is something that gets elaborated out of a simpler set of natural language behaviors or not, if it's something that is already there, either in a certain cognitive structure or something like that. These are all important questions, but yeah, the point is, if this is not justified in the genetic sense of, cognition for the transcendental approach, it seems to presuppose that, oh, it is a fact that mathematics says the structure of stuff, like it's able to say the structure of things. I think this is the main issue.
Yeah, I agree. The problem for me is that I can you hear me? Okay, I just changed my.
Yeah.
My point is that two things here. One that I think is quite exemplary, and the second, which I think is something we already discussed. The second one is that there is, in my opinion, I don't see any contradiction. Like, I can easily see people having different interests. I mean, go for it. Propose a philosophy that describes genetically these things, but my problem is that you have to start reading about neurofucking science, and it's not going to be philosophy. The things that say consequential things, verifiable, novel things about this is not philosophy. So that narrative is not going to be a philosophical one. It's going to be something else. So it's going to fit ultimately. It doesn't. There is no problem. I really don't see like why it's not compatible. It's just like, I mean, I feel like there is an offense to the transcendental approach in the fact that the genetic part is substituted for the sort of, you need something about like engaged experience needs to be thinkable, and that's the genetic of it.
No,
right?
I think that's a perfectly fine statement.
Yeah, but that's what he substitutes for a more genetic account of whatever.
Yeah,
but the second part, which I think is very interesting, which is I feel like I can engage in a debate on Badiou and Kant, Badiou and Reza, and go into like explore their formal approaches and how they connect Ludwig's and Heyting algebras and whatever. But I do feel like it's always very complicated to stick to the sort of non-philosophical unfolding of something if Badiou is not kind of giving a sort of thumbs up that you're allowed to do that. Like even here,
You see, the problem is what you mean about. I think this is the thing this is kind of a noise that we always have in our conversation, is what is philosophy? I mean, I mean, this seems to be very important for you or for Badiou that it is not philosophy that will say this and that, whereas I don't really know what philosophy is. I don't see the stakes there of being philosopher or not philosophy. Maybe I will end up doing something other than philosophy, and I'm fine with it.
To be very, very blunt and to use a response that a famous Chinese guy said to when people said, but everything can be philosophy. I don't know what philosophy is. Lin Biao said, that's the philosopher's question. Like outside of philosophy, we know very well when you're philosophizing rather than doing politics. Like,
I don't think we know.
Yeah, I mean, there are things, for example, in this text we're discussing.
Philosophy is like Nelson Goodman's treatment of art. We don't really know what art is. We have symptoms of, art, or symptoms of philosophy, maybe some disjunctive theory of, the identity of philosophy or of art, like you don't have a set of, necessary conditions that is very difficult to come up with. But, you have a symptom like, okay, if you have like 3 of those, it seems that's philosophy or something like that, something more broad like that. Or if you have 2 of those, it looks like art, something like that. But I don't really know everybody knows about philosophy. I mean, for all I care, if you talk a little bit difficult thing, if people think you're doing philosophy, you might be doing psychology, you might be doing whatever, So I don't really think that there is this, also this is a whole different area with Badiou, like the thing about the different generic procedures and all that. the limit between that, I wasn't really convinced about this, never was really, you know, and because I don't think there is any standpoint whatsoever where you can look at these things and say this is exactly that and this is that other thing. You might come up with candidates, but not really clear-cut distinctions. And I don't think you can talk what is philosophy, say what is philosophy outside of philosophy either. I don't agree with that, but okay, this is not.
No, I can tell you, the reason why I can tell you this is because this text was written to introduce a case study, to highlight an experience connected with a specific political experience and give it some legitimacy. And we're discussing, you know, if Badiou's Platonism goes together with the transcendental genetic account, rather than showing how the transcendental genetic account would make anything of this more relevant. That's what I mean. That's what I think the Maoists were claiming.
I will get to that. This is my presentation.
Yeah.
I'll get to that.
Sure, okay, but it's just my point. Like that sort of spiral that is so easy to kind of suck us in.
But the same thing can be said from the opposite side. How do you know beforehand that the transcendental approach won't say anything about that?
No, I just tried it for a long time. That's what I was saying. Zizek considers him a transcendental materialist.
Yeah, I know. Zizek is much more of a transcendentalist, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I tried it, but that doesn't matter. I mean, I'm fine with trying everything. I'm not talking about you. I mean, I'm the one who's like pushing this discussion in the same direction. I just think that this is a good example of this sort of different vectors of movement. You know how it is very hard to turn this sort of to kind of make it so and justify that something that hasn't even been defined as this organizational thing might be shedding the light and deciding what is irrelevant and irrelevant discussions. I think we tend to easily fall on the inverse side because it's more easily arguable. And the reason for that shift is exactly what the concept of thinking Badiou is trying to show, right? We can end up in a sort of more classificatory structure of saying, okay, this approach against that approach, or you can actually kind of cut through and sometimes combine them in weird ways. If you have the problem as the sort of, you know, if you assume that it has a standpoint, right? It is something that sees the rest. But I agree, in this text, it is amazing to me how far we went with just because Badiou's use of thinking, but yeah, we can do without it as well.
No, yeah, I mean, you can redescribe this framework with other frameworks. I think you can, but nevertheless, use Badiou. It's perfectly fine for the purposes of, you know, CSI and this paper. Actually, I skipped some stuff. There is this thing about Agamben. Actually, you go from Zizek to Agamben, then to Rancière, and then to Badiou, right? I didn't really comment upon the Rancière bit. Maybe I should have done so, but this was already from a different, as I told you, this was from a different class. There was a lot of things already. It was just one class, like I have 2 hours to present, you know, the Reza thing and your stuff and come up with some kind of conclusion. So the Rancière was like, well, lots of artists are here. Maybe they know this, you know, Rancière a bit better than the other stuff. So, and it was kind of less relevant to the theme of the thing. That was the relationship between worlds and life forms of life. So the course I was giving, right? So this is why I chose the Agamben to comment on, because he's using this idea of forms of life. And that what's relevant here is this idea that a life that cannot be distinguished from the rule. This is what Agamben calls a form of life. Life that cannot be separated from its form without ceasing to be life. At stake in the investigation of the form of life is therefore a very similar problem to the one we have previously formulated. Marx. So here's the shift between, you know, this idea of a social practice that can produce real abstraction and the form of life itself that has has a form, there's an abstraction that is produced by the social practice itself and provides, well, I'll just read it. Marx has shown us that social practice can produce real abstractions which are disjunct from any particular thinker of that practice. For example, the fundamental abstraction which produces the homogeneous social being of commodities. Such an abstraction will therefore present two properties. It does not pre-exist the social practice, but is produced by it. It provides the conditions for such practice, but not as a regulative principle to which participants willingly adequate themselves. This is very important. Otherwise, we could just think that as a kind of a rule, right? A rule that is a regulative rule that you ought to adequate to, right? This is actually, this puts the finger on one of the issues I have with Justin Evans' paper, like why capital is not a space of reason, because, you know, it seems to be like a pattern governing behavior more than a rule obeying, you know, example of behavior. To affirm that such disjunction between individual thinkers and social thought might in fact produce emancipatory effects means that we must be able to conceive a practice which, not disavowing the existence of this thought without a thinker, nevertheless establishes a different relation to it than the one encountered in commodity exchange. So here the Agamben comes in, right? Here the Agambenian account might defeat the purpose of our investigation. If a form of life ceases to be that life it is once separated from the rules that give it form, the project of life forming finds a limit. The controlled revision of the rules that we are after might be in fact nothing else than the adoption of a different form of life. This can give rise to a Sorites paradox. How many rules ought to be changed before the form of life A becomes form of life B? But this is kind of, you can circumvent this, you know, you're just redefining what the project is of revision of life form, because it will entail eventually the modification of the form of life, right? The thing is, if you take the Agamben concept to mean that it has to be stable and more than that, unstated, the rule must be unstated, right? Then this is the condition for the form of life that it is. So yeah, this might have some problems for the account that I'm trying to build on the idea of life forming, that is.
Yeah, but I think that in other passages, Agamben is closer to you in the idea that there is a constant revision process. In the case of the monastery here, I think he wanted to show the reflexive aspect, right? The book of rules includes rules about reading the book.
Yeah.
Right. And
I think, and then you're relating to Zizek from the fact that there are rules that are unstated rules that are actually the rule, because to the rule itself, like in a sense, like the rule. Yeah,
one of Agamben's points, and I think that it's very kind of a sort of spiritual Wittgensteinism sort of thing.
Yeah, like, yeah, it is.
He defines Franciscan form of life as the sort of what he calls dispensation from the rule, right? Is the sort of joy that the rules you follow are not written, but in the following. So to write down that you need to pray would be obscene, because why would you want to support that rule on something other than the fact that you habitually pray? So if you want to know about Franciscan way of life, you can't read it. It's not written anywhere. But you might not even be able to ask one specific Franciscan, because he's doing things out of habit, and the habit supports the set of rules he follows. But the set of concerns he needs to have in order to follow the rules can be things like, I cannot lag behind my friends. So if you ask him, what are you doing? He might say, I cannot lag behind my friends who are doing a bunch of stuff. So you won't learn about what the Franciscan form of life is. There's a disjunction between the accounting for it, the practice that goes with that accounting, right? And the actual, let's say, stating of it. It's not that it could not be written, but if it was written, it wouldn't be the rule that it is, right?
Yeah, like making it explicit makes a difference.
Yeah, it makes a difference. And in that sense, like rule obeying and rule writing, right? The sovereignty and the subject parts, they are very intrinsically connected, right? And I think that's a very important point for Agamben. Like the fact this is not written anywhere makes the doing the writing in a way, right? The closest thing you have to the sort of perennial existence of this is the practice. So it does seem to kind of revolve around these themes of real abstraction, right? Something that has a weird abstract character, but it's also not removed from practice towards something else.
Actually, yeah, arguably exists because of the practice, right? But yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of instantiated there, but the thing being instantiated doesn't exist prior to it. So, yeah. You know, but just something I wanted to mention. You know, you skipped Rancière, but Rancière is the guy who has a sentence, like a whole book about equality of all intelligences.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah. This
Yeah, so there's this funny kind of you substituted.
I was justifying I was skipping Rancière because you know, because of contextual problems. But yeah. Yeah, so there's I see what you mean, but then there's in my own parlance, this problem, the second problem is at stake here is a form, if the form is the actual rule-based pattern governed unfolding of a form of life, isn't this eliding by itself the difference between rule and pattern? Difference seems to depend on the answer to question B above. It provides the conditions of such practice, but not as a regulative principle to which participants willing and adequate themselves. So this is kind of important, and this is a point that gets lost on Reza, for instance, on the Brandomian account. It seems, because what's interesting here from your account, what I'm taking from your account in a sense is that, of course, you have kind of in the CSI, this is very, very, very crucial. Like, I could just skip some stuff. Like, for instance, there is a description of the functioning of a circle in that text, and it is basically a set of rules, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it instantiates a pattern, but the pattern is not really foreseeable from the rules. It is exactly that. The rules are empty enough, so you have a certain foreseeable behavior. You expect certain sets of behaviors, but then there are consequences to these behaviors that are also not on the rule obeying, under the rule obeying category, but more under the pattern governed one, in a sense, because every rule obeying corresponds to a certain pattern governing. So if you get back to I think I have this, of the Brassier account, the thing is, it seems that from the cognitive side, this is what interesting me. The cognitive side, you have pattern governed, he says here, pattern governed behavior is ubiquitous in the biological and physical realms. So any stupid fucking, process is instantiating a pattern. So you don't really have cognition, you don't have intelligence. This is the point of view of Ray here. Physical systems realize complex patterns without intending them. The pattern is incarnated by the components of the system, each part of which constitutes it, but the constitution is effectuated by something as mindless as a wiring diagram, right? But the thing is, here he's putting like the pattern governed as a condition for rule obeying. Like, you have to have pattern governed behavior in order to make a difference, even to recognize a difference that will be a condition for objectifying a rule. Like the difference, and he thematizes this as the difference between acting for a reason or acting because of a reason. Like, acting because of a reason is an instance of rule obeying behavior, contra, acting for a reason, like the reason can be completely out of your control.
So what you are proposing, in a sense, and this is like the condition for, you know, the account of rationality that the Salarzians are putting forward, okay? And I think maybe this is blocking a certain path towards a certain approach to politics, because everything then is tethered to, you know, the explicitating unfolding of, you know, concept use and rule following, and the practical, you know, side of that, in a sense. And this is.
Can I ask you a question? Like,
this is what has in mind, like, you know, communism, because communism is like a demand of reason. This is a way of putting it, right? It's a demand of reason, because if you elaborate the demands of reason enough, you'll get communism. But this is the obverse of what Marx is saying. So in a sense, you can map this obverse, you know, onto the very fact that once you get rule-obeying behavior, you don't stop there, because rule-obeying behavior is also instantiating another pattern. And then you have this scale, this different scale that emerges from rule-obeying behavior that you are not sovereign upon. You don't have a sovereign position upon it. Like you're instantiating it even because of your rule-obeying behavior, but at the same time, it is surpassing any rule that you are in fact obeying, right? So this is kind of building upon. You can think like a certain multiscalar analysis that takes as a primitive, you know, this interplay between actually the pattern and the objectivation of the pattern as a rule-obeying behavior. So you can like recast the whole thing in, you know, Wittgenstein and Brandomian, whatever terms, like that. So this would be like what I was thinking of, and what I think it's very productive from your paper is this reversion between, you know, rule-obeying towards a certain pattern governing, and you don't know what the pattern will be. Like, this is why it's an experimental practice. You don't know what the pattern which pattern will be instantiated by the rules you are putting forward. And then you have like this feedback loop, right? You put a rule out there, and then the pattern gets instantiated, and then the collective is reading off its own behavior and trying to come up with different ways of dealing with the shortcomings of the rules that we are obeying, in fact, and seeing what those differences will entail in the resulting pattern as well. So sorry, I mean, I got really Gabriel dropped out of the meeting.
Oh yeah.
So, sorry, go Yasha.
Oh no, I was just saying, yeah, I noticed he dropped out.
Yeah. So yeah, so this is the basic idea of the disjunction between participatory and knowledge. So this is what I'm gesturing towards. Like, our initial wager has been that there are ideas which are only thinkable on the condition of a practical engagement with certain forms of institutional organization. Well, again, he's having difficulty today. As we have shown, this led us as a first step to examine the notion of real abstraction at play in commodity fetishism. As we have shown, Marx's analysis of a form of value hinges on two operations: A, an indiscernibility between thought and social being, insofar as a value relation which abstracts from all concrete determination of commodities being compared. The social being is indistinguishable from the act of comparing two commodities in order for the first to get its immaterial value expressed at the material body of the other, making value thinkable. And B, a decentrament, okay, he's there, a decentrament of this coincidence in regards to thought, for the site where being and thinking are the same only takes place negatively. It is not that we, as participants of the act of exchange, think, but rather the thought implicated in the very social form of our practices. So, from what I was saying before, I mean, the thinking here, it seems to be like the bundle between the pattern that is being instantiated and our recognition of this pattern. So this is how I'm, in a sense, I would say, Gabriel would say that I'm reducing, Badiouian thinking to a certain set of things, some of which are not under our control, and some others that are the result of a cognition, a certain form of cognition. So in a sense, I'm transcendentalizing the thing. Yes, something like that. So yeah, we get to Badiou.
Wait, I have a question. So, but I think the key point is, how do you handle when the pattern becomes converted into knowledge, right? Because you can have a pattern which is like a surprise effect of the rule, but then that pattern can become, let's say, like translated right back into either a set of rules.
Yeah. The problem, I think one of the problems that I have with I understand that this is not the way Badiou is construing this, and maybe he's not seeing use for this. But this is the whole point for me. In a sense, I mean, in order to be a case of thinking, it seems to me that there must be some form of cognition, actually, in a sense, because of course patterns get instantiated everywhere. In nature, in inanimate matter, everywhere patterns get instantiated. So if you are dealing with pattern and rule obeying, like, it doesn't seem sufficient condition for you to have thinking just to instantiate a pattern. Okay, first thing. So it's
yeah, nobody's saying that though, right?
You need an interplay between rule and pattern. So I would reconstruct the idea of thinking, of the organization thinking itself, as a kind of interplay between rule and pattern. This is the way I would do it. I mean, tentatively here, of course. This is a trial.
But Caron, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm again in the cell phone. Sorry. No, what I was gonna say is that I think Dennis' question is really the central one, because we actually started this research like, oh my God, almost 15 years ago, like in a place that is very similar to where I think Reza is. Like our initial, the very, let's say, thought process behind the propositions of the circle were actually developed from an account of collective practice that had a sort of dialectical intrinsic connection between following the rules that you create, then you will hit upon obstacles, and these obstacles are then reintegrated through new rules, right? So the basic idea in this document called the Propositions of Pensée, which was like our first attempt at moving from so like moving from philosophy to a kind of political organizational standpoint, was precisely based on a sort of theory, like a Hegelian theory of revising normative commitments, and the sort of Hegelian wager that where concepts fail or where they are insufficient, it's also an opportunity to revise your concepts and reconstruct them and so on. And so I think we actually began in a place that was closer to that. And there were actually some ideas that really resonate with this. Like we used Hegel in a way to kind of augment Lacan, where Lacan had a very static concept of the real, like formalisms get to stumbling blocks. Just assume that that's going to happen and deal with it. Like that's what it's about. It's a very tragic kind of paradigm. The Hegelian version gives it a twist and says, well, but where you hit a rock like that, you can still revise your own rules, turn negative moments into new information, something like this, right? But I think that this is the line of inquiry that if you go a bit further, that's how you get to Badiou as an interesting companion to that idea, because much that like the problem that you're stating here with pattern governed behavior and rule obeying, you could, for example, distinguish it in terms of the light went off again. Between things that present specific differences and our capacity to explicitate the formulas that gather them together.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that's the difference between sets and power sets. Right? The set of all formulas that can give us some subset out of sets that are absolutely randomly and purely extensionally defined with no necessarily common properties. Just it's a kind of analog of a pattern.
Unbounded things.
Yeah. And well, the point for Badiou is that you cannot turn sets, you cannot augment the power set simply by self-reflection on the sets that you're constructing them from. Like if you don't have some added machinery and a third category, which he calls a site, there will not be, let's say, patterns that have rules, possible rules hidden in them, not given, right?
Yeah,
but let's say,
I would parse what you're saying. Like the site is a set of rule-obeying behaviors as they are in a certain moment, like something like that.
What Dennis said,
the pattern, it's
like, but the thing that Dennis was asking about.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, my point is that the thing that Dennis was asking about, like, what about pattern governed behaviors that becomes or participates in a new rule, right? That's what the theory of the site, event, generic procedure kind of flashes out. Because otherwise, the tendency is that you think that there is a sort of spontaneous process of self-revision, like we're bound for this to happen because that's what we are.
Yeah, I see. I see what you mean.
But you try to not take that as a given.
I'm not committed to that. I'm not committed to a specific recipe for turning a pattern into a rule. I mean, I don't think I can talk anything about that in a general sense. Like, of course, maybe some stuff can be thought about because they are part of the framework I'm using to analyze this, like the difference between seeing and seeing as, like, which has to do with embedding the thing that is seen into a certain conceptualization or a certain category. And you can test different sets of categories and relationship between categories in order to see how, a certain new pattern fits or doesn't fit, like something like that. But it is like a test failure thing. I'm not saying that you have like a fixed specific protocol for turning a pattern into a rule. No, nothing like that. But you have like a certain set of commitments that has to do with the difference between sheer data, and I think dropped out again. Sorry, guys. It's really difficult today to have this conversation.
Oh, he's back.
Yeah, it's really hard today to have this conversation, Gabriel. Are you there? No? Wow.
Are you talking to me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, because I was responding to you and then you dropped out again. So, are you there?
Oh man, it's like the fifth time the light goes off and on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how should
now? No.
Yeah.
Kind of.
No,
it's cutting out a little bit.
Yeah, it's not feasible because I think you're getting my message like 3 minutes later or something like that. So it's kind of difficult to have this conversation. I don't know. What do you guys think? Should I go on or maybe pick it up some other time? Because of course it's just Gabriel, but we are having this discussion. I mean, I don't know what you guys think we should do.
I think Pedro also had the problem, right?
Yeah, because it's not feasible like that, you know. I mean, I could present to you, but Gabriel will be cut out of the conversation really, because he's not online really now.
Yeah, I mean, you can continue if you like. He said he'll watch the recording later of the rest of the
Okay.
slides, but up to you.
Yeah, okay. So I'll try to keep it brief then. Where was I?
Oh yeah, just to go back to my original question here, it was so this slide, it says the disjunction between participation and knowledge, and what Zizek is calling the kind of reality whose ontological consistency implies a certain non-knowledge. That's actually not a complete disjunction, right? It's basically saying, in order to participate in this reality, you must have a non-knowledge of the participant. So it's actually a dependency relation, right? Not knowing this implies being able to participate.
I just meant that because you're participating, you're not knowing. Like you're not knowing.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not knowing just because you're participating. It's just that what was meant, right? This is what I meant what was meant by this junction, right? And this
okay,
is
I see.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. Nope.
Yeah. I mean, that's just an interesting type of connection, right? I mean, it's not exactly what Badiou proposes, right? Badiou doesn't have that kind of negative language of not knowing something in order to participate in a world or something like that. It's for Zizek, it's more of this.
Yeah, you know, I think
Lacanian thing.
I think this points towards something that I find kind of lacking, which is this relationship to cognition in a sense. I mean, even if Zizek is saying that basically you have to not know something in order to participate, this counts as an engagement with the cognition of the participant in a sense, right? And from the transcendental point of view that I was discussing with you guys before, this is crucial, right? This is crucial, and this is crucial also to the fact that you don't want to presuppose that, you know, like the structure of the real is given to the mind. So you have to come up with the protocols by which you come up with theoretical frameworks that are able to explain reality. So this is my main, you know, Salarzian injunction that gets, you know, in the way of simply accepting, you know, thinking as Badiou says, even if, you know, taking into account everything you are saying, both you, Dennis, and Gabriel, about, you know, all the procedural approach of Badiou, it seems that, you know, for me, it's always presupposing the causal efficacy of, you know, a formalism that doesn't get explained in the sense of being first being the product of a certain work on a certain matter with a certain set of formal ingredients, and why is it efficacious in a sense, right? So this has to do with my transcendental commitments in a sense. But then I think this is very important because, and this was what was appealing to me from the in the circle that I'm discussing here, which is this interplay that I think Gabriel was trying to explain, like an interplay between, you know, he was explaining like a kind of a gap or a kind of bump in your formalism, but not necessarily a bump, but the very fact that because you have a set of participants obeying a certain rule, you have a pattern instantiated that is not reducible to the rule you are obeying. So this is kind of important, and this can be mapped in a sense onto what Zizek is saying, that is absent from, you know, the Badiouian properly Badiouian understanding of this in a sense. So I think this is crucial to the understanding of the functioning of the circle for me. And then Gabriel starts discussing or exposing the functioning of the circle. I'm not sure everybody is familiar with this here. So yeah, well, in Tubinawa's work, the knowledge one has as a member of the collective does not coincide with the knowledge of the collective as a collective, so to speak. That in its indifferent unfolding instantiates a thinking in which the members are participating. So here's a relevant excerpt. A given chair participates in the idea of chair. Its multiple being is seen as one from the standpoint of the idea of which it partakes. This could lead us to assume that to participate in an idea, in the case of a political organization, means to treat the actual concrete organization as the local case, and our apprehension of it or our imagination of its ideal version as the form. But what it gets is rather the opposite. The organization itself, in the indifferent or negative universality of the formalism it embodies, is rather what carries traits of the general or generic idea, and those who are formed by it, workers, ignorant men, etc., are the multiple unified from the standpoint of a social formation. Participation becomes, for Badiou, the name of an immanent mediation between two regions of the world, a set of determined beings and a practical formalism which differs from its determined situation. Okay, so here's the relationship between participation and thinking from the Badiouian point of view. But one can be justified in asking if participation defined in that sense, this is what I was discussing before, in that sense is sufficiently delineated in order to not lapse back into the ubiquitous instantiation of patterns one sees in nature. While a pattern, of course, encodes information, it is unclear whether encoding information is sufficient for having knowledge, which in our account entails having the ability to either perceive correctly or put the piece of matter of factual information into a framework that is capable of attributing form to it. So here it's kind of wordy, but the fact is, just instantiating a pattern is a sufficient condition to having, form or knowledge or having thinking. This is the basic question I'm putting forward here. While Russell's account might be sufficiently fine-grained regarding the conceptual unfoldings of thinking, the demand for the concrete emancipation of minds might fall back in Marx's indictment of the idea of communism against the concrete movement of abolition of what is. Tupinamba's text, while putting forward important constraints regarding the rational consequences of concrete organizations, elides, in our point of view, important distinctions between pattern-governed and rule-obeying behaviors, because, this is the way I was re-describing what's at stake in the circle, right? So let's take a look at our four different aspects of this formal structure: how to enter the circle, how to stay in, how to position oneself in it, and how to make its failure predictive. So I'm calling this form becomes content, because you're putting just a form into it, like a form of entry. There's no content being judged in a sense. Like I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with this. Like in the circle, you just have to fill an admittance form, and there's nothing prejudged that you have to put into that. You just have to fill it. So it is the act itself that counts as the admittance process, right? So you just have to perform an action. It doesn't matter what you are saying when you perform the action. So, and this injunction will give you the content of the unfoldings of the collective, in a sense, because you will have to fill a form for which there's no rule regarding what you are putting in the form, because the form just asks you to write a commentary on the project of the circle, right? So in the sense, the admittance form functions a bit like the door of the law in Kafka's parable. It looks like an examination will take place, and many people do in fact become paralyzed before the obscurely simple criteria of entry. but the only wrong answer is to dismiss the examination as illegitimate. So if you don't fill the form, or if you write there that this is bullshit or something like that, you are not accepted into the circle. So there's B, the permanence. So the entry form is not the determining operator of belonging in the circle's logic. Rather than deriving consistency from a mechanism that distinguishes the inside from the outside of the collective, CSII relies on a different protocol which privileges the connection of one meeting to the next, the work note. And the work note actually has the same kind of indeterminacy regarding content. Like once someone is accepted into the circle, the only necessary commitment of this participant is to write after every meeting a short anonymous note of any content whatsoever. Every cell meets on a weekly basis, but once present in these meetings is in fact considered secondary to the handing in of the work notes. It is the presence of the writing that marks one's engagement with the project, not the physical presence in the meeting space, and also not the content of the notes, right? In the circle, the indeterminate space created by the purely formal character of the work notes produces a similar absence, which is equally followed by a certain form of transferential work of displacements and suppositions concerning other members and the group itself. This enactment or realization of transference ultimately allows the circle to treat some of its obstacles and the other who would be responsible for such interdictions as objects of interpretation, even though there is no one in the position of an analyst. Okay, I can skip a little bit. So see the position. So the constitution of a circle cell requires that there be at least two people, for this is the minimal number necessary for distributing the two basic positions which compose its functioning, the +1 and the general secretary. I won't really comment much on the +1 and the general secretary. The general secretary usually is somebody like in Brazil is like our friend Alex. He's in charge of every material issues. He was in charge because the circle was reformed. I would say dissolved, but actually reformed into a different thing, right? But Alex was. I think Alex will be still the general secretary, but he's in general he has to keep the website and deal with money and these kind of things. And the +1 is a very interesting position that is usually is a rotating position, like anybody can be the +1, which is somebody who's in charge of taking hold of all the notes, the work notes, and giving them back to the circle in a sense. You have to provide a certain summary, of course, from your point of view of what's being said in the work notes that are of actually an indeterminate content by the rule, right? So the process, in order to grasp the circle's functioning, we must consider at least two distinct temporal instances. The first one, where the group meets in order to collectively study and debate, and the second one, where the study is applied to the maintenance and transformation of the collective itself. The results of this second moment are then inscribed back into the first. This is what Gabriel was talking about. It's actually written in this paper, further orienting the direction of the circle's theoretical investigations. So content becomes form, the opposite, right? While Badiou's conception of thinking is adopted precisely for its disjunction between the knowledge of the participant and the knowledge of the organization, we can extract from Tupinamba's text itself a possible answer to the difference between pattern and rule. So mobilizing a distinction between constructivist and experimental endeavors engaged in by the circle, Tupinamba comments, that is, CSI lacked the knowledge of how to distinguish the investigative activity of an idea from the constructivist engagement with an ideal that was simply not that of the institution at stake. However, insofar as this experiment was not attempted for the sake of proving the circle's own ideal apprehension of itself, so that its failure would put the collectivist's real leftism in question, but rather with the aim of verifying if it was possible to export CSI's fundamental wagers into new contexts, This failure was homogeneous with the circle's organization, internal to it, because this experiment composed the trajectory, I think this is really crucial, the trajectory of a thinking, which was later at the disposal of its member as a challenge for thought. So there is a second moment wherein the results of the organizational watching itself are extracted by participants, which is then fed back into the thinking of the organizational practice. This amounts for us to the passage between being or instantiating a pattern. This was what I was talking about some time ago. Being or instantiating a pattern and thinking proper, that is seeing something as something that is possible to locate within a conceptual framework. So the constructive endeavors are usually only confirmations of leftist identity, while the experimental ones are usually thought of as probing into the constraints that make up worlds independently of the thought one has about them. So you are instantiating patterns you are not conscious of, and taking into account constraints and affordances of this, space of possibilities. The very fact that the results of a group engagement are only afterwards taken as material for thought attests to a difference between being and thinking. And this, I think, I part ways with the Badiouians, wherein thinking makes a difference in being once the pattern-governed unfolding of the organization is conceptualized, acknowledged, as Wesley Negarstani would have it, as a conception of a pattern to be further tinkered with. If you don't have the conception of a pattern, you can't really tinker with that pattern consciously, right? You can't really revise a rule. You'll be producing further patterns without really taking hold of this process, right? So this is where I think cognition is important, in the sense of not being a sovereign position of the thinker producing things, but the thinker participating in an organization where she doesn't hold a sovereign position will engender different patterns that in a second time will be recognized by any means possible, by any means that are available, any symbolic means, any cognitive means, and this in turn will be conversed into rules that can be tinkered with and continue the process in a sense. So this would be a kind of a way to put in this immanent thinking, this philosophy of immanent thinking truth procedures, this cognitive approach that has to do with the transcendental philosophical approach that I'm usually committed to. So there's this also this example that has to do with my previous works that I think it illustrates well how I think about these things, that is kind of different from Reza and kind of different from Gabriel. So my approach, this is about the doctoral thesis. I did a doctoral thesis on John Cage from the point of view of inferentialism. So it's kind of weird, but yeah, that was the project. Dennis knows all about, because I did a presentation of this like a couple of years back to the circle. So my approach in L'Indétermination à l'œuvre, this was defended in France, like in Paris, Paris 8 University, was to offer a transfer from the problems of ontology, the science of being qua being, of being qua totality, as first philosophy, to the philosophy of action as the shaper of identities. I mean, don't get caught on this business of science of being qua being or being qua totality, because this is a quote from a different text, and the idea is that you have historically these two concepts of ontology that are one is more akin to metaphysica specialis, special metaphysics, and metaphysics generalis, general metaphysics. Being qua being, general metaphysics, being qua totality, because you're talking about the collections of different entities there is, like special metaphysics, right? From Wolffian Wolffian framework, metaphysical framework. So the idea was to transfer from the problems of ontology, because there are a bunch of problems of the ontology of works of art, what is a work of art, and all that. And since I was dealing with John Cage and 433, these kind of let us say exceptional kind of entities, my take on it was that a more interesting way of approaching this was to transfer these problems to the philosophy of action, like what is being dealt with when you perform something like 433, right? So offers a transfer from the problems of ontology as first philosophy to the philosophy of action as the shaper of identities. So objects wouldn't be thought of as given, but as made by certain forms of socially instituted action. This philosophy of action is modeled, in turn, upon a philosophy of language that takes as its core Wittgenstein's reflection on rule following, together with the contributions of the revisability of images of man in the world as presented by Wilfrid Sellars. In this approach, the composition and performance of works is seen as a case of applied normativity. It results from rules assumed as a condition of a determined activity, the creation, maintenance, continued existence of works of art, the identification of which as specific objects is the result of the norms of said practice. Like, in a sense, it's like, I would say that ordainment, right? Like, these are entities that are the result of ordainments, in a sense. Like, they are not physical objects or given physical things. They are culturally defined, they have culturally defined boundaries that come with the rules of a certain practice. For instance, the practice of going to a concert, listening to a piece of music, for instance. So they are thus.
So you're saying it's like an ordained by culture or something?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like
makes sense.
From that point of view, if you adopt, for instance, the point of view of the implicit norms and explicit rules, right? You have kind of like implicit norms of behavior that makes something like the production and consumption of works of art thinkable, right? And you can explicitate them, make them explicit as rules, and you could afterwards tinker with the rules themselves. So in a sense, is what Cage is doing. Like in the original text, I'm using is it here? Let me change this, the sharing, just a sec. I'm using this notion of Harry Flint's. Let me share this other thing, just very quick. Yeah. So this idea of, I'm reading 433 as something like that. In our interpretation, so usually a piece like 433 is considered as an opening to whatever happens, a suspension of the composer's intentionality, a relinquishing of the legislation of her personal tastes, in order to pave the way for the appearance of phenomena unforeseen by author, performer, and public. In our interpretation, in addition to performing the novel rules put forward by Cage in order to distance himself from its results, 433 exhibits the very ritual of giving a concert as material of the work, as it is emptied of actual content. This is very similar to the CSI in a sense, like every action is kind of emptied from content. You just have to perform this action, and the very fact that you perform it and you chose as content such and such is relevant information, right? So just in passing, a kind of interesting relationship there. But here you are required to not do anything, right? And what fills in the time of the piece is whatever is happening at the time of the performance. So as it is emptied of actual content, the performer's position of authority on the stage justifies the audience's reverence for a ritual that follows a protocol that no longer serves its initial purposes. Traditionally, listening to sounds that come from the stage. So you're not doing any sounds in the stage, right? But you still act as if somebody is doing sounds from the stage.
So it's you are kind of emptying out the rule from its habitual aims, right? And this is possible because you made explicit a certain structure of behavior where you can make invariant the structure while changing the aims. So this idea of protocol modification was proposed by philosopher, musician, and conceptual artist Henry Flint under the name of constitutive dissociations. Consider a situation or configuration which is established by ordainments or stipulation of rules. The situation may belong to a genre which is standardized, a genre having a protocol which is standard or straightforwardly ascertainable. Moreover, the genre may have customary aims, although they do not have the force of requirements. Constitutive dissociation, CD for short, comes about because the instigator of a situation alters the aims of the genre from the customary aims. Since the traditional aims are foregone, the instigator can evade or replace standard protocol with an inscrutable protocol. So this is Flint's way of understanding it. I offered a different take on it in the last thing that I published at eFlux. I don't really... Sorry, go on.
This reading by Flint, it seems like it kind of I guess like maintains the possibility of reading 433 as like kind of a shitpost, yeah, or like trolling, because it's like the audience is coming just to engage in the ritual of this like worshiping of the artist, even when he's not doing anything. They know he's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting. Like it's not just like doing it for
just
for the sake of doing it, you know,
something like that. Yeah. I mean, Flint is
I like that reading.
Flint does not like. I mean, I know Flint, right? He's very pissed off, and when people are using like this idea of constitutive dissociation as like a medium for coming up with gags or jokes or something like that. He's trying all the time to distance himself from the Fluxus movement, which he was not really part of it. But he engaged with them several times. He published in that collection an anthology from Fluxus that was organized by George Machiunas and Lamont Young. So he was in the vicinity of Fluxus. So he does not approve of everything they do. But yeah, it can be applied to something like a gag or a joke. But then you are able maybe to differentiate between different levels of constitutive dissociation, right? Like you have this kind of reading of 433 as some kind of joke or something like that. But even if you read it as some kind of joke, the structure is there, like what is doing really. It is exemplifying a structure of behavior, even if you have like a kind of comic effect going on with it. And it's not unusual for something like that to come with a comic effect. Another artist that uses this a lot is a friend of mine, which is Martin, is a Basque from Spain, Basque artist. He come up with this idea of social dissonance that has to do with relinquishing the role of the performer and making the audience do certain things, and usually they are kind of uncomfortable things. So people either laugh or they get offended. So yeah, these things come about, but they are kind of I treat them as independent of the they are independent of the specific structure being produced, right? I mean, they are like an after effect in a sense. You're not doing it for the effect, even if the effect might be there, the comic effect, or maybe people will be uncomfortable and all of that. So yeah, but I think this is very
the audience thing is interesting. I think there's an artist, Holly Herndon, that did a similar thing with using like the sounds from an audience to train an AI to produce sounds, and then using that to make some work. Holly Herndon.
Holly Herndon, yeah, of course, I know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is something you can do easily in art, really. I mean, this is why I took this example from aesthetics. I mean, And this all, just full disclosure, like this is the way I got caught up in the problem of organization and politics and all that, you know, because in a sense there is a kind of indifferentiation there. Like you can do that in art, but because you are intervening not upon sensible contents, which is usually what you take to be the material of art, but you're intervening upon organization itself. So the kind of political the possible political consequences are much more intimately connected than, you know, just, you know, like you're intervening upon the same kind of material that is what makes politics, in a sense, right? It's not just the organization of sensible contents, it's the organization of behaviors, the organization of people, in a sense. So this was the passageway I had at the time between, you know, aesthetics and politics. And then the last chapter of the thesis was talking about what does it mean to have a critical form in art, in a sense. So and then I was kind of illustrating the shortcomings of doing it within the art world, right? But it is not a shortcoming. It's not a difference between art and politics that is substantially justified. Like there is a thing there that is art. There is an habitual thing. There is like art usually deals with the organization of sensible contents, right? But it can deal with these other things. And politics usually deals with, you know, organization of behaviors and people, and, you know, yeah, in accordance with certain ethical concepts or not. So there is nevertheless a shortcomings. I'm not equating the two, but there is nevertheless a kind of common ground between certain forms of aesthetic action and certain forms of unfolding that has to do with the political, such as the unfoldings, the behavioral unfoldings one can get from seeing what happened to the CSII, you see, from following those rules and all of that. So there's some zone of indiscernibility, to use a Deleuzian turn of phrase there, which interests me. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, that is emptied out of actual content. The performance position of authority on the stage justifies the audience reverence for a ritual that follows a protocol that no longer serves its initial purposes, traditionally listening to sounds that come from the stage. So
yeah, it's another idea based on what you guys are just saying is the distinction between syntax and semantics kind of has relevance here. It's like if enjoying music or sitting down to, you know, appreciate music is a kind of a semantical, adding a semantics to something which doesn't need it, because it can be just viewed as a series of, like you said, like actions that are ordained in some sense, then you actually can assign totally different semantic content to that set of actions, right? And I feel like that's kind of what happens in politics quite often, where depending on where you stand politically, you assign different semantic content to the same thing. Like you and another person might look at the same protest happening, and you will assign completely different like content to that protest.
Yeah,
depending on your position.
Yeah, and this has to do with the. I mean, this is not here because it will be too long. I mean, presentation, but this has to do with, for instance, the problem of the avant-garde. Like, as for instance, Peter Bürger talks about it, which I thinker that I like a lot. He says that a real project of the avant-garde was not really an artistic project. It was a project of the dissolution of art into life. Okay. And this was a failure. So why is this a failure? So this paper I'm trying to also tackle or suggest something about that, in the sense of functional differentiation of certain social spheres, right? because once you start doing it in art, and you kind of are now expected to do it in art, you're just now reinstantiating the art loop, the art condition. It will be more art than before, not less. So this is a paradox that something like this come up with, right? Like there's a paradox that emerges here. But the tricky thing is that this artistic gesture is not anymore defined by its material, by its semantics, right? There is a certain syntax that illustrates. It's actually almost the same thing that we were talking about, but something analogous that can map onto the difference between a pattern governed thing that gets caught in a rule obeying thing, like. You have this syntax of revision. You revise the syntax, and the revision of the syntax gets seen as the semantic content of the act. And because the semantic content of the act is the formal revision of the syntax, you will get caught up in art, because this is what artists do now. So this is a tricky thing, right? So it's very difficult to if you as an intellectual exercise would want to think about the completion of the project of the avant-garde, how to do this, like it's in a sense impossible nowadays. But nevertheless, anyway, yeah, some relationships there. So so we can, on this model, construe a form of aesthetic action that generate a phenomenal results, taking as its material the normative infrastructure of the aesthetic action itself, the rules and protocols of action that result in the constitution of artworks, that continue to be artworks as long as there is a normative infrastructure that recognizes things, bundles of sensible content subsumed under concepts as artworks. So that very wordy thing, but I think it captures the dynamic of the process here. Last paragraph makes an explicit a dimension of one, the interrelation between different systems, as in the normative social system of the art world, and the causal natural system of the individual, like in the sense of being a subject, like a logical subject, having cognition, right? In this paper, I'm also engaging with Thomas Metzinger. He's somebody Zizek talked about already, as somebody from neuroscience, right? So I'm kind of building a bridge between this social normative account and, the difference between a phenomenal self model and being a logical subject. So, but we don't need to talk about this here, even though it is interesting. And though two, self-referentiality of the art system qua normative infrastructure that can take itself or its components as material while integrating the phenomenal dimension, because it will always yield some phenomenal dimension, right? Even if you empty out the content, the traditional content of a certain action. So the trajectory to pursue would be not just to mend art with life, yet an inexplicated notion. So this is the project of the avant-garde I was commenting upon, but to coordinate that which is internal to art itself in a system in order so as to conquer a space in which art can no longer be art. So this was my interest at the time. That is, the trajectory of its functional differentiation must be radicalized, not as abrupt opening to its outside, like with Cage. He thinks by emptying out the content, he's opening art to its outside. He's not. He's actually, because he's enmeshed in the normative infrastructure of art, he's just producing an image of that opening. So it is art in a sense. That is, the trajectory of its functional differentiation must be radicalized, not as abrupt opening to its outside, like Cage, but as a patient working of the concepts that organize the sensible and now the normative materials that compose the practice. The workings of the art system are also the workings of the concept as a guide to action, as in our Wittgensteinian thesis regarding the ontology of the art world. I mean, that transference from the problems of ontology to the philosophy of action, right, that I was mentioning. Normativity in the sense is not just that which conditions action, but that which is also conditioned in return. The transformative vector of practice is opened once the rules that guide our practices are not only themselves given proper forms, but also become content. Thus, our rules themselves become the materials subjected to a structuring intervention. So the Cagean position would then be reinterpreted, not as an opening to the outside of the subject's synthetical powers, which was what Cage wanted. He thought he could bracket the subjective determination of contents because he didn't want to compose anything. He just produced whatever. He produced a rule that would produce whatever happened as a result, like whatever an indeterminate sensible content, right? So you can read that as, oh, he's taking the subject out of the equation. So I'm taking issue with that, not as an opening to the outside of the subject's synthetical powers, but as a clearing. Now I'm gesturing towards Heidegger, kind of provocative. I'm not really a fan of Heidegger, but I thought this was fun. But as a clearing that illuminates its inner workings as a logical subject. The structural scaffolding is prone to revision under the thesis of the synthetic nature of the self, in contradistinction to the synthesizing activity of the subject. And then Raz wrote something this week about forms of life. Just to wrap up what I'm talking about, this was an example, but I think you can see easily how would I understand the issues of, you know, the circle in this framework. You see, I mean, it has to do with ordainments. It has to do with the results of ordainments and the forms of subjectivation of those rules that those ordainments would bring about. And this could be thought of as, you know, a form of thinking if you want to keep the Badiouian vocabulary. But I'm trying to describe this in terms different from the terms that Badiou himself is doing. I see the use for this, but at the same time, I'm trying to kind of build a bridge between the cognitive approach that Reznor has and comes from this post-Larsian framework and this Badiouian immanent unfolding of truth procedures, which I'm also interested in, you see. So here what Reza basically, yeah, this is almost the subject of the course I gave, but anyway, we are all tangled in the maze of language and conception, which organize and inform our experiences of ourselves in the world. But for us, i.e. humans, dissociated from what being human entails and has as its consequences, language is taken for granted as something trivial, a naturalistic medium of communication. This is anathema to me. Okay? Or as something transcendent and hence ineffable in its nature. Yet once we become self-conscious of the nature of language, not as a medium of human communication, but as a vast logical computational framework that can be diversified and constructed out of the bounds of sense, we are in principle in the domain of imagining new languages, hence new life forms, new worlds. As Wittgenstein remarks, to imagine a life form is to imagine a language. Living as a life form demands that its members share a space of possibilities. Accordingly, being human as a life form necessitates partaking in a form as a field of possibilities. Language, or what can be called a general artificial language, like Wittgenstein's language games as a generalizations of language, is in this sense the most expansive space of possibilities without which the intelligibility of life is voided and its possibilities remain untapped. General artificial language, however, ought not to be imagined as necessarily having words or even tenses. So then he tries to build a bridge between this Wittgenstein notion of forms of life and the Carnapian idea of, you know, the tinkering of syntax and the formulation of a multiplicity of different kinds of language, like he says in the logical foundations. The structure, not the structure of the world, the logical construction of the world, the other one, the logical structure of language, right? That has the principle of tolerance and all that. So There's a problem with
Yeah,
that, obviously.
I really like this.
I'm not, sorry, go on, Yash.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I like this reading. It seems like it like reinserts back to what we were talking about before about like active, like thinking of things as like participation in them. This like reframes participation in language as like, I guess like the foundation. Where also I want to ask, where did he write this? You said it was this week.
Sorry?
Where was you said he wrote this somewhere new this week? Where was this?
This is off this week. This is in Parasol 5. I can send you.
Oh, okay, yeah.
WhatsApp.
I'd like to read this one.
It's a whole issue about the zone. They ask people to write about the zone in the sense of the Tarkovsky's Stalker, you know. So Reza expanded upon this idea of forms of life and kind of an indeterminacy as to if you are revising the form of life perpetually, like if you are in a kind of zone in a sense. So there is a poetic thing going on already.
Sure.
Also, but yeah.
Yeah, if you could send us, that'd be great.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, you can get. This is why I put this quote there. This is relevant. This is unilaterally close to what I'm doing. I mean, part of what I'm doing is this. It has to do with it, but at the same time, it is a theoretical point of view, right? Because one can ask, who's the agent of this reformalization of, you know, the form of life? Who's doing this, right? So this is a problem. Like, of course, from the armchair, you can do it. You can imagine different form of life, but this does not have political traction, really, per se. Really, you see. So this is why Gabriel's work is important in that sense, because the fact that you are organizing in something practical, and this organization, which, you know, aesthetic action is also an example. This is why I was exposing from where I come from in music and in art. Concrete organization can be an experimental means for tinkering with the rules of a form of life in a controlled environment. So the Reza's account has this problem that is a blind spot of who's doing this. I mean, who's doing this? Who's doing the revision? Is it always going? Oh, yeah. You can defend that it's always ongoing, like Wittgenstein would defend. But then it's not a controlled kind of revision. It's just something happening. You are instantiating a different collection of patterns, and you don't even know what the pattern is, right? So this is a problem of control. This is a problem of, you know, seeing as, like, you have the pattern, but you also want to see the pattern. You also want to understand the pattern and be able to change the rules that are engendering the pattern, right? So this is the problem. Reza has a good grasp of what kind of logical devices get enmeshed in this, but he doesn't have a good grasp of what does it practically mean. It seems that he thinks it's by revising logically, you are already revising in practice, which is not really, does not follow really, right? So this is a problem. So while Reza's project takes forms of life as analogous to bundles of rules to be decoded and recoded in accordance to both the concept of a human qua subjectable to elaboration and of intelligence as the extraction of intelligibilities, it remains tethered to a theoretical space which traction upon practice remains mysterious, right? My own position, what I call life forming in analogy with world making, takes as leverage specific practices wherein there might be a possibility of actually describing its components, both through the theoretical means available in the space of reasons and the experimental unfolding of organizations that take the human as material, much in the sense of Gabriel's paper. This amounts to a piecemeal revision of practice, the consequences of which should be taken into account. While this might strike one as trivial, it's not so trivial once we ask the question of the criteria of individuation of practices and the criteria by which practices might be described. the interplay between a general framework, but because why is it not so trivial? Because if you say, oh, let's revise the form of life, from where you start? So it is important to have like a platform in a sense, right? Something like the CSII is a platform, or something like a constitutively dissociated aesthetic practice is a platform. So you have like, here you have kind of a superposition between, you know, the localized account of, you know, unfoldings that you get from Badiou and, you know, a kind of a general framework of, you know, revision of language that you don't know really where it is going in a sense, but you have at least this minimal framework of understanding certain taking things as something. You see, seeing as, not just seeing. Like you have a previous conceptualization that will get transformed by the immanent unfolding of organization. See, so this is the point, the whole point. The interplay between a general framework and individual experimental spaces of organization might function as an insulated medium within which to experiment with forms of life. The way the particular consequences get mapped onto the general framework is open to question, of course. I don't have an answer to that, and of course, it's largely up to the ad hoc case. How does this map back into a general framework that you are using to read the situation, right? So truth procedures exist here as an immanent unfolding of practical goings-on that are equivalent to experiments in particular types of organization that are always enmeshed with concept use and revision of conception of rules in the case. Right? So some questions for development. This is part of my own endeavor, which is called Form and Scale. The project of Form and Scale follows from the recognition of the centrality of seeing as to contemporary political projects. It harvests the results of our investigation of a particular vector of escape from a particular field of practice and tries to generalize it with the addition of the problem of scale. This is very wordy and very obscure. I was mentioning, I intended to mention here for instance, the constitutive dissociation, the idea that you can reform a certain localized practice, okay? But at the same time, there are types of reformatting that supersede one's cognitive powers. Like I'm also a kind of fan of, you know, Kantian sublime. So, I mean, there you have like an illustration of something, some difference of scale that can be, emerges out of the impossibility of immediate conceptualizing of something, and the problem of scale is apparent in that. So it can be.
Are you saying from moving the I guess the change in scale is moving to like the space of like possible reconstructions of like
something like that? Yeah. I mean, once I showed Gabriel this project, it was like, of course, you would expect him to be like, he liked it, but he was like, I don't understand why you are choosing the heroic path. Like, you're coming from the point of view of like some normal Joe that then is like crushed by the sheer weight of the different scale and the impossibility of understanding what's going on. And whereas he's coming from the Badiouian side that, you know, no, you don't need this guy, you don't need the Joe, you just need the, you know, commodity sync, like Dennis and Gabriel are doing commodity sync commodities and things like that. You just need the immanent strata, right? Of course, maybe it's more practical that way, but I want to kind of found this relationship to scales in a cognitive apparatus. So this is one version. And another is, well, I come from art as well. So I'm interested in the existential aspect of participating in a different scale as well. So this is what's heroic about it, in a sense. You see. So there's a kind of a shift of concerns a little bit that make my project a little bit different, even if it feeds off Gabriel and Dennis and what we do at CSII and Badiou and all of that, but it mixes with a different set of influences as well, because of these concerns, I think. So Gabriel was asking me why you need this heroic account, like you're kind of narrating almost like a narration of a certain subject coming to understand like the complexity of the different media where he's living in, right?
Well, that's because you're an artist, right? That's the perspective of an artist.
That's pretty much,
as opposed to like someone thinking maybe more primarily from the perspective of like a political actor or something, which is more like in the communal,
I guess so. I think this is something that is part of the project. I think, as I said, I think I'm interested in the existential problem of how to inhabit these worlds. So the recasting of thinking as the extracting of intelligibilities and these as a form of seeing as, and of seeing as a guide for the individuation of processes, paves the way to the investigation of form in its mediation with scale. So then you have this cold logical account of how do we individuate form and scale, right? Because you have to have it as well. I want to have the heroic thing as well. So the hypothesis of capital as space of reason demands to be disambiguated between a complex pattern that is instantiated as capital and a rule-governed space that offers leeway and leverage upon such pattern, just as I was talking about in the CSII and in the case of the Gaussian aesthetic procedure, right? I would resist putting this in terms of objective versus subjective phenomenology, since language as a medium for the extraction of intelligibilities is not subjective, really, right? So the status of formal systems as prior or second in the order of explanation, for instance, as a product of algorithmic elaboration out of natural language, amount to the choice of different orientations of thought, the consequences of which should be studied. This is also something that interests me, like the difference between taking formalism as first in the order of explanation, or actually as something that emerges out of natural language. This is also why I'm interested in the Brandomian framework of practical elaboration of one kind of formalism out of another. So this is very, very interesting to me. So, and then I finish with this quote from our joint article, our joint paper, against what remains the main theoretical strategy of the left, that is proposing better descriptions of our current social reality in such a way that our theory is capable of locating and expressing the inconsistencies and weaknesses of our social system in ways that conservative depictions cannot. We want our theoretical space to be infinitely richer than our social world, so that capitalist social formations might appear within it as particular solutions within the broader space of other possible solutions to general problems of social coordination. This is just to justify the multi-scalar approach that I have in common with Dennis, with Gabriel, and everybody here. Allocation of resources, the free association, the strategy of regionalizing or situating the parameters of our social formation has profound effects both to theoretical construction as well as to the practice of politics, since the first sign of a broader theoretic framework is its capacity to reformulate problems in its own terms, which I think I'm kind of doing, meaning that within this framework, communism becomes a theory of how to solve communist problems, which is crucial, and not capitalist ones. Right? So I think this would be it. This is the ending. A
good unifying way to end.
Yeah.
Bringing together
I like it. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of I of course I'm here for a reason, right? We have like I'm into this common project anyway, but with certain declinations certain specificities regarding, I think, theoretical frameworks, right? Anyway, I was just trying to illustrate then how we can go from, you know, this, like Reza's thing, then to this disjunction between participation and knowledge, and then to this, you know, content becomes form and cage and all that stuff, you know, like how we can re-describe everything in such a way that you have localization, immanence of truth procedures. At the same time, you have, you know, logical resources, and you have all this way of understanding abilities algorithmically, in a sense. You see.
Yeah, these artistic examples I think were really helpful as well.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, really, I put them in like last half an hour before we started. Because,
yeah.
just because
it helps to
yeah.
make it more concrete.
Yeah, it makes more concrete. I agree. I was actually going to show more things, but you know, it's already 10 o'clock here, so we can leave it at that, I think.
Yeah, sure, great.
And thank you guys.
That's really good.
Thanks,
I just
JP.
one more comment is, yeah, on the artistic example, the aesthetic example. I think now it's clear this Cagean moment of kind of subtracting away the semantics, or what we said was kind of this content of it. It is like the procedure of embedding in a larger space, right?
Yeah.
Just connecting it to the last quote, that
yeah.
You are saying, you are problematizing the series of actions that constitute like appreciation of art in a shared space. You're saying,
like you are amplifying the space where you are considering a broader space, and in that broader space you will see this game of appreciation differently. Like it changes.
Exactly.
Yeah, it changes the unfolding of the immanent situation, because you are placing it into a larger framework, which is also part of what I'm interested in. Like here in Brazil, we have this big almost dispute, like big argument with the folks of, you know, perspectivism. Perhaps you are familiar with it, like Viveros de Castro, the people who are talking about incompossibility between, you know, Amerindian ontologies and different ontologies, and they are very opposed. Usually, they are opposed to, you know, these multi-scaling strategies and rationalist multi-scaling strategies and all that, because they insist upon the incompossibility of perspectives. But I think the incompossibility of perspectives is, at least in principle, defeasible, you know, by the conquering of broader spaces. Because if you put the two perspectives in a broader space, they might not be as incompossible as they appeared. See.
Yes, I really like that idea, because I see the problem in what I said earlier about like two people see the same protest and you have totally different interpretations of it, right? Because based on your positions politically. But if we stop at that point, it's basically falling into relativism, right? It's just saying, okay, then what's the point of protesting? Exactly. You're never going to have the same message. Your message is not univocal, right? It's going to be perspectival. But then if you affirm that there is a common space where the protest is taking place, that common space cannot be simply like different. There must be by definition a common space. Two people are seeing the same thing on that level.
Yeah.
And that common space is where I think everything is revolves around, right? How to elaborate that?
Yeah. Like I think it's a kind of there is a metaphysical blocking, like in, you know, perspectivism. Like they want to, in my opinion, my position, they want to kind of exaggerate the difference, so as you don't have any common space possible. But the true fact, I mean, the obvious fact, I mean, is that Amerindians are there, and you know, the Brazilian state is killing them and all that. So there's a bunch of relationships, even material ones going on. Like I mean, it's not like of course we can inhabit different worlds, like in the symbolic sense or in the logical sense, but they are not isolated from each other. So, which means you must be able to put them into a common framework and see what comes from putting them in the framework. Like which relevant traits will be relevant, right? And see how things react to being put in a different environment, right?
Yes.
This is a place where that distinction between Negrestani and Badiou about whether or not there's a universe of worlds becomes pretty relevant too, right?
Yeah, I would say so, yes. Even though you don't really need to uphold a one, then I think Badiou is okay with that in that sense. Like Badiou says the one is not, but okay, but he's not presupposing that he's not presupposing a fixed limit for worlds or truth procedures. Like you see, you can, and if you enter in relation with another object, you are almost automatically in the same world, you see. So he's not presupposing like an unmovable limit between worlds, even if the one is not. You don't really need the one for that. You can come from, you can build it, how do you say, bottom up. Like you can build these relationships bottom up. Whereas
like human experience, you're saying?
Reza is building it top down, I think, mainly because he's presupposing the universe of discourse. Whereas you can just see the different perspectives and how would they relate in a sense, and come up with a common ground. Like not in the, please people, not in the liberal sense like of agreeing or anything like that. Just in the sense of having a common framework where you can understand the positions and describe them under the same set of assumptions. And this makes a lot of difference, right?
Well, especially if you're saying that like the violence between the Brazilian state and Aboriginal groups constitutes a common ground, like we're not talking.
No.
But we're talking like a strict space of reasons in which like the rationality of violence is consistent across, or something like that.
Something like that, exactly. Yes. Yeah, that was great, man. Thank you for the questions.
That was great. It was really helpful.
Yeah.
Really good.
Thank you.
I thought, yeah, your art examples really took and made a lot of tangible stuff from last week. It really helped to crystallize it, I think.
Yeah, it was supposed to be one session, but we got caught up in so many discussions. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we can wrap up.
Okay.
Unless somebody wants to still comment about something else.
No.
Any lingering questions?
I think we're okay.
Yeah, we'll just continue it in WhatsApp.
Sounds
Okay.
good. Thanks, JP. This was very interesting.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank
See you
you.
next week.
See ya.
Yeah, take care. Good meeting.
Bye.
Everyone.